Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thank you for caring about your faith and your community and your fellow American citizens. I really appreciate your testimony today. Dr. Jasser and Ms. Namani and Ms. Ahmad, each of you spoke of your concerns regarding the growth and extremism of Islam within the United States. I share your concerns about this trend. I wanted to ask you how you think we should balance this with an individual's right to worship as they choose, and what, in your opinion, is the critical distinction between more conservative Islamic religious practices and those activities that subsequently lead to radicalization and violent extremism activities? Now, I know that Ms. Patel may have covered this. I had to step out for a second. But if you can respond to that, and how can we find the balance that protects an individual's right to worship as they choose, but ensure that our communities are safe and secure? And how can we support the moderate Muslim community so they can, it's as an alternative path to radicalization? These hearings have been terrific, very productive. But what can we do? It's been very informative, but what can we do in addition to these hearings?
Well, I believe that Ms. Patel has a valid point that religiosity doesn't necessarily equal extremism. That, in fact, the Amish indicators, are very much parallel to the ones of a religiosity in a Muslim man. But what I think why we have to have this conversation and why we need to continue to educate ourselves about what terrorism and extremist ideology looks like is so that we can make those distinctions. I believe that, we need to include religion in our threat assessment because we need to identify very clearly how those indicators related to interpretation express themselves. So that doesn't mean because a guy wears his pants up high that he is a terrorist. He may be practicing a tradition of the Prophet Muhammad that he thinks makes him much more religious, or because he grows his beard a certain length, it doesn't make him an extremist. But what we can do is figure out what it is in terms of his ideas about the Jews, the Christians, the West, and other elements become indicators for terrorism. And that's why I believe that our administration's policy of excluding Islam from that conversation is, quite frankly, naive and very short-sighted.
Thank you. Dr. Jasser.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Bilirakis. I think ultimately what's important and what you can do is to begin to foster platforms, engagement on this issue. And just as in the Cold War, we finally came as a nation to a consensus that communism was a threat. And we didn't have to fire any bullets against the Soviets directly to finally move towards building think tanks and filtering our military and others for those ideological infiltrators. Similarly, Islamism, I watched the hearings on military assessment that you all did. I think if you look at Nasser Abdul, for example, the fact that the Assistant Secretary of the Army gave him conscientious objection status, I find to be offensive as a Muslim. So many Muslims serve proudly, but yet we allowed this individual that turned out to be a terrorist to use his religion to hide behind an excuse to serve this country. And I think ultimately what happened was because of political correctness, our own army could not identify the threat. The Fort Hood report itself does not identify any of the ideologies it should have. And until we can't come to a consensus that Islamism is a threat, and that's why you need Muslims that are doing this reform work to lead the movement to separate Islam from Islamism.
I couldn't agree more. Anyone else on the panel want to address this? Yes, please.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think perhaps one of the most important roles that you can help us is to have a conversation where we take away the shield of Islam from those who subscribe to Islamist ideologies, whether nonviolent or violent. And in fact, the two are deeply connected. The nonviolent mechanisms do involve subscription to beliefs that are counter to democracy, that involve supremacism, and are often deeply rooted in anti-Semitism. These have no place in Islam. There's no way to describe them without talking about the values of Islam or searching for enclaves within collections of Muslim people, whether they're in Pakistan or whether they're in the United States or anywhere else in the world. As to your point about how to protect a Muslim's right to worship, let me tell you, as a Muslim I am more free to worship here than any other Muslim majority nation that I've ever been to. Our rights are not at risk. This is not a civil rights issue, which many people are beginning to make. And we must remind individuals who are American or not as to how those freedoms are protected. That's being lost in the debate. Just because we're scrutinizing an area for a problem doesn't mean anybody's civil liberties have been intruded upon.
Thank you very much. Ms. Patel, I don't know if you wanted, I know you touched on this, but thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Patel's the opportunity to answer, sure.
Yeah.
Just real quick.
Microphone.
Still learning. Just real quick, I think that the comments from my co-witnesses, I guess, sort of illustrate the problem, which is that what we are talking about here, what they are talking about is, you know, how do you distinguish different Islamic ideologies? How do you strip Islam from political Islam? You know, those are important conversations, and I certainly wouldn't want to quell them, but I'm not sure the government has a role in those conversations. The government has a role in talking about which version of Islam is good and which version of Islam is bad. Government's role comes when we come to violence. When a particular ideology, regardless of what it is going to impinge on society, is going to affect public safety, that's where government has its most legitimate role, and that's where I would encourage you all to focus. Thank you.
Actually, the time has expired.